Dusk came down over Ironvale like a lid pressed over a flame. The light snuffed, the cold let in, and the forest at the territory's edge breathing out a slow, dark exhalation that smelled of pine resin and something older, something that had no name in the common tongue. Rhea stood at the boundary stone with her daughter's hand in hers, and 3 days' worth of food in the bag on her back, and she did not look at the pack gathered behind her. She looked at the trees. She counted their trunks the way her grandmother had once taught her to count through fear. 1, 2, 3, 4, until the trembling in her legs stopped being terror and became something she could walk on. The decree had been delivered at sundown, as all such decrees were. It had been delivered in Theron's voice, which was the worst part, not in the voice of his second or his court scribe, in his voice, low and final, carrying across the assembly ground with the particular quality of sound that meant it had already been decided before he opened his mouth. Exile, immediate. The charge had been spoken aloud for the pack to witness. Contamination of bloodline record. She had not understood those words when she first heard them, and she did not understand them now. She only understood that Theron had not looked at her while he said them. Mira was 4 years old and did not understand what was happening, only that it was serious, only that her mother's hand was holding hers more tightly than usual. She had her father's dark hair and her mother's gray eyes, and she smelled, when Rhea pressed her face into the top of her head, like warm bread and the cedar soap they used on bath nights. Rhea breathed her in once, a long, slow breath, and then she stepped across the boundary stone and walked into the dark of the Ironwood without turning around. She had met Theron 11 years ago, in a summer that felt, even in memory, like something borrowed. Too warm, too full of light, too generous to have been real. She had been 22 and newly arrived to Ironvale from the eastern settlements, carrying a cartographer's satchel and a commission to map the northern reach of the territory for the Interpack Registry. The Alpha King at the time had been Theron's father, a broad-shouldered man named Arkin, who smelled of iron filings and old rain. Arkin had welcomed her with professional courtesy and assigned her a workspace in the outer hall, and she had been content with that, had asked for nothing more. She had been crouched over a drafting table on her 4th morning, wrestling with the scale on the northeast quadrant, when the outer door had opened and Theron had walked in. She had known before she looked up. The mate bond didn't announce itself with ceremony. It arrived in the body the way weather did, as a pressure change, as the sudden awareness that the room had reorganized itself around a new center of gravity. She felt him in her sternum first, a slow pull, like something deep in her chest had turned its face toward light. When she did look up, he was already watching her. He was 26, and tall in the way that alpine trees were tall, not performing it, simply occupying the full extent of their vertical space. His hair was dark, his jaw carrying 3 days of growth, and his eyes on her were not the eyes of an alpha surveying a newcomer. They were the eyes of someone who had just remembered something they had not known they'd forgotten. He had walked to her table without invitation and looked at the map she was drawing. "You have the river wrong," he said, not unkindly, as if they were already in the middle of a conversation. "The surveying rod reads 17 meters, she said, not looking up again. "The surveying rod hasn't accounted for the spring shift. The Vel runs wide in the melt season. You'll need to account for that if the registry is going to hold." She had looked up at him then, fully, and she did not look away. "Show me," she said, and he had. They spent 6 hours correcting her northeast quadrant that afternoon, standing close enough that their forearms touched across the drafting table, neither of them moving away. He knew the territory the way she knew the grammar of maps, bone deep, without having to search for it. She understood, by the end of that afternoon, that the pull she'd felt when he walked in was not going to diminish. It was going to be the defining condition of the rest of her life. She had been right about that. She just hadn't known in which direction. They bonded that winter in a private ceremony in Arkin's hall, small by pack standards, attended only by family. Arkin had embraced her with gruff warmth and told her she would make strong-minded heirs, which was as close to a compliment as he ever came. The pack at large had watched the bonding with complicated feelings. She was an outsider, a cartographer from the eastern settlements, a woman with no pack lineage to speak of, no bloodline in the registry. Some of them never entirely stopped watching her with that particular quality of attention that meant they were calculating, reassessing, waiting. Theron had shielded her from the worst of it, at first. She had felt him do it, had seen him redirect conversations and redirect attention, had watched him manage the space around her with a competence so practiced it looked effortless. She had let herself believe that was love. Later she would understand it had also been management, that the same instinct which protected her from the pack's scrutiny was the same instinct that had, 11 years on, concluded she was a problem that needed managing in a different way. The night before the exile decree, she had stood in the kitchen of their house, the one they had built together during her second pregnancy, the one with the east-facing windows that caught the morning light on the map table she still kept in the main room. And she had heard Theron in the study with his court scribe, heard the rustle of papers, heard the quiet iteration of charges she did not yet know were charges against her. She had stood with her hands flat on the kitchen table and listened, and she had not understood. She had told herself she was wrong about what she was hearing. She had not been wrong. The charge, when it came, was this: that her bloodline registration, submitted to the Interpack registry at the time of their bonding, had contained an irregularity. That her Eastern settlement records showed a matrilineal connection, 3 generations back, to a bloodline the Ironvale registry classified as severed, a bloodline that had been formally cut from the pack record 40 years ago following a disputed succession. It was not, technically, a crime. It was a condition, but the court scribe had argued, and Theron had agreed, that it rendered their bond retroactively irregular, that it introduced a question of lineage validity into the line of succession, that it needed to be resolved. The resolution was exile. She had been given 3 hours to pack. She had not argued. She had not screamed or wept in front of the pack at the assembly, though the assembly had been called deliberately. Theron's decision made public, made irrevocable by witness. She had looked at him once while he read the decree, looked for the man who had walked to her drafting table 11 years ago and said, "Show me," and she had not found him. She had found an alpha king managing a problem. She had found the machinery of power working exactly as it was designed to work, and she had understood, in that moment, that the bond she had felt in her sternum all those years ago had not stopped existing. She could feel it even now, bright and aching like a burn on the inside of her ribs, but that Theron had made a choice that existed separately from what the bond felt. He had chosen the registry over her. She had picked up Mira, and she had walked to the boundary stone, and she had not given him the satisfaction of looking back. The Ironwood at night was not a place where Ironvale wolves went willingly. It pressed close, the canopy overhead so dense that even the cloud-covered winter sky was invisible, and the ground underfoot was uneven with roots and frost heave. Rhea had been walking for 40 minutes, before Mira's feet began to drag, and she lifted her daughter onto her back without breaking stride, settling the small weight against her shoulders, feeling the child's arms wrap around her neck with the automatic trust that was its own kind of grief. She had a destination. She had not planned to have a destination. She had not believed, until last night, that she would ever need one. But she had spent 11 years making maps, and she had spent those 11 years paying attention, and she had noted, on the northwestern edge of the Ironwood, a structure that did not appear on any official registry chart. She had added it to her personal records with a small notation, possible habitation, pre-registry construction, and had not mentioned it to anyone. She had not known why she kept it to herself. She knew now. The structure was a keeper's house, built in the old style with stone foundations and a roof that had been re-shingled within the last decade. Someone had been maintaining it, someone who was not on the registry. She had thought about that irregularity, periodically, over the years, and she had connected it, gradually, to something her grandmother had told her, that the severed bloodline, the one the registry had cut 40 years ago, had not simply disappeared. That severed did not mean gone, that it meant underground, meant hidden, meant waiting. Her grandmother had been part of that bloodline, and apparently, in Ironvale's registry, so was she. The house appeared through the trees after 2 hours of walking, during which Rhea had sung Mira quietly to sleep against her shoulder and had not thought about Theron except when the bond pulled at her with the particular urgency of distance, the way it always had when she traveled east for registry consultations and could feel, in her chest, the exact direction back to him. She had not let herself follow that feeling for 11 years. She was not going to start now. A light burned in the house's single window. She stood at the tree line for a long moment, Mira warm and sleeping against her back. Then she walked forward and knocked. The door was opened by a woman who was 70 years old and looked it, white-haired, narrow-shouldered, with eyes the same gray as Rhea's own. She looked at Rhea for 5 full seconds without speaking. Then she said, "You're Calla's grandchild." "Yes," Rhea said. The woman stepped back from the door. "Come in, then. I've been expecting you for about 11 years." Her name was Venna. She had been waiting. That was not a figure of speech. That was the practical reality, in this house in the Ironwood, for the precise eventuality that had now arrived. She had known, when the Interpack registry began its cross-referencing review 3 months ago, that the irregularity in Rhea's record would surface. She had known what Ironvale's court would do with it. She had stocked the house accordingly. Food in the cellar, a second cot in the back room, a store of the dried herbs that Rhea, if she was anything like her grandmother, would need for the child's cough that winter air always brought on. "My bloodline," Rhea said, sitting at Venna's table with her hands around a cup of hot water and dried juniper, watching Mira sleep on the back cot through the open door. "Tell me what the registry actually says." Venna told her. The severed bloodline was not what Ironvale had recorded it to be. The disputed succession, 40 years ago, had not been a legal irregularity. It had been a suppression. Arkin, Theron's father, the broad-shouldered man who had smelled of iron filings and old rain, had been the one to commission the severance. He had done it to remove a competing claim from the Pack succession record, a claim that ran through the matrilineal line of a woman named Diva, who had been Venna's younger sister and Rhea's great-grandmother. The claim was not to leadership, it was to land. To the northeastern territories that Ironvale had absorbed in Arkin's early reign, territories that Deva's descendants had the old registry right to settle freely, without permission. Arkin had erased that right by erasing the bloodline from the record. And 40 years later, his son had enforced the erasure, not because the record was corrupt, but because the record now threatened to give Rhea's daughter a land claim that Theron's court had already allocated elsewhere. Mira. The exile was about Mira. Rhea sat with that for a long time, her hands around the cooling cup. The bond in her chest was steady and far away, like a lantern left burning in a room she'd locked behind her. She let herself feel it, briefly, let herself feel the full weight of what it had meant to wake up next to Theron for 11 years, to watch him father their daughter with that careful, deliberate tenderness he had, to build a life inside the warmth of what she had believed was the simplest possible truth about herself. That she was his, and he was hers, and that was the bedrock. The bedrock had been a record correction all along. What did he know, she said. Theron, how much did he know about the land claim? Venna looked at her with those gray eyes that were her own eyes reflected in an older face. Enough, she said. That was the word that broke something, not his signing the order, not the assembly, not the pack watching, not the 3 hours to pack. Enough. He had known enough, and he had signed anyway, and he had stood in front of their pack and spoken her exile in his own voice, and she had heard the love she had spent 11 years learning the shape of being used to close a door. She did not cry. She sat in Venna's kitchen and breathed, and in the back room she could hear Mira's slow and steady sleep breath, and the bond in her chest pulled at her with its useless, unconditional warmth, and she told it, silently, with the particular precision of a woman who had spent her career drawing the exact lines between territories. Number. The days in the Ironwood had a quality she had not expected. Not comfort exactly, but a kind of density. Mornings that began in the blue hour, before full light, when the frost on the window glass made small ferns, and she and Venna would sit with their cups in silence, while Mira slept, and the forest outside breathed its slow, cold breath, and Rhea would feel the bond in her chest like a compass needle, pointing unfailingly northeast. She stopped fighting the feeling. She simply noted it, the way she noted landmarks on a survey. Here, this exists. This does not change what I am doing. Venna taught her. That was the right word for it, though it felt, at times, less like learning and more like remembering, as if the knowledge was already somewhere in her body, and Venna was simply telling her where to look. The severed bloodline had not been only a land claim. It had carried something else, something that the registry language called an attribute and that Venna called, without apology, an inheritance. The matrilineal line of Deva had been cartographers, surveyors, boundary walkers, but the boundary they had the deepest gift for was not the line between territories on a map. It was the line between what was recorded and what was true. What that means, practically, Venna said on the 4th morning, rolling a piece of old vellum across the kitchen table, is that you can read the land record the way I can read the land. The registry markup is not just notation to you. The marks themselves carry the original intent of the person who made them. You've always known when a map was wrong. Rhea had. She had always known, had put it down to professional experience, to the particular pattern recognition that came from 12 years of surveying. But she remembered now the first map she had ever made, at 16, drawing the eastern settlement boundaries for her grandmother, and how she had known, with a certainty she had no instrument to justify, that the western border had been drawn too far in, that the original mark was 20 meters east of where the current registry showed it. She had said so and been told she was confused and had not had enough experience to argue. She had been right. The old registration records, she said slowly, the ones that Arkin had filed when he severed the bloodline. Venna's eyes sharpened. Yes. They're still in the Iron Veil Registry archive. I've seen them. I've walked past the sealed cases in the archive room 100 times. They are, Venna said. Rhea looked at the vellum on the table. Old, the kind of old that meant pre-registry, the kind that was written in the original boundary notation that only a handful of people in the Interpack system still knew how to read. She looked at it and felt, for the first time since the assembly ground, something that was not grief and not fear. She felt the particular, clean-edged calm of a woman who had spent 11 years making maps and had just been handed the original survey. "I need to get back into that archive," she said. Venna nodded. "You'll also need witnesses. Registry challenges require 3 pack-acknowledged witnesses to the original document, or 1 witness from outside the disputed bloodline who holds registry standing." "Gale?" Rhea said immediately. Gale was the Interpack Registry's Eastern liaison. She had known him for 12 years, since her first commission. He held standing in 6-pack territories and had, more than once, told her that if she ever needed a formal witness, he would come. She had smiled and assumed he was being professionally gracious. She was revising that assumption. She sent the letter through Venna's contact, a young courier from the borderline settlements who ran messages between the pre-registry network's remaining members. The letter was 3 sentences. It said where she was and what she needed and asked Gale to come. It did not explain what she was doing or why, because if Gale needed an explanation, he was not the witness she needed. His reply came in 4 days. 1 sentence. "Coming. Arrive 14th of the month." That was 6 days away. She used those 6 days. She walked the Ironwood in the mornings, Mira on her back in the early hours, and then running ahead on the frost-crisp ground once the light was full enough, chasing the small gold birds that wintered in the understory. She used those walks to practice what Venna was teaching her, the reading of ground, the way the earth held the memory of old boundary marks, the way skin held the memory of scar tissue. She found 3 pre-registry markers within a kilometer of Venna's house, stones that any surveyor would have dismissed as random, which carried, if you knew the notation, a clear record of the northeastern land boundaries as they had stood before Arkin's reign. She also found, pressed beneath the largest of the 3 stones, a sealed canister of the kind used for registry original documents. Inside was a copy of the pre-severance bloodline registration for Diva's line, complete, witnessed, dated, in the original notation. Venna had placed it there. And waited for someone to come and read it. "You knew," Rhea said when she brought it back to the house. "I knew what the land remembers doesn't stop being true because someone files a different paper," Venna said. The bond pulled at her, that night, with unusual force. She was sitting with the document open on Venna's table, cross-referencing it against the territorial marks she had noted in her 12 years of professional surveys, building the evidentiary chain she would need to file the challenge, and the pull came from the northeast, from Ironvale, from the house with the east-facing windows, and it was not the diffuse background ache she had become accustomed to. It had direction and urgency. It felt like Theron. She put her hand flat on the table and breathed. She knew what the bond could do, in moments like this. She knew the particular seductive logic of it, that it existed for a reason, that it meant something, that what it meant was that she should go back, should allow reconciliation, should let the pull of it override everything she had learned in Venna's kitchen. She had felt that logic pressing on her every day for 11 days, and every day she had looked at the document on the table and at the sleeping child in the back room, and she had answered it the same way. She was not going back. She was going forward, and she was bringing proof with her. Zale arrived on the 14th. He was a compact man in his 50s, with a surveyor's hands and 3 decades of registry standing, and he looked at the document Rhea laid before him without speaking for a long time. Then he looked at the ground markers she had documented, the photographs she had taken, the cross-reference surveys spanning 12 years. Then he looked at her. "This is a full severance reversal," he said. "Yes. The land claim restores to Mira's matrilineal line." "Yes." Theron signed the exile order. "Yes." Gale was quiet. Outside, Mira was playing in the frost-clear morning with one of the copper pots from Venna's kitchen and making a sound like a small, determined bell. "He may not have understood the full scope," Gale said carefully. "He knew enough," Rhea said. She said it the same way Venna had said it, with the same flat precision, and she watched Gale's face register it. "All right," he said. "What do you need from me?" She told him. They filed the challenge to the Interpack registry on the morning of the 15th. Gale carried it personally. That was the proper procedure for a severance reversal, a physical presentation to the registry court at the Central Hall, with the witnessing documents attached. The registry court would convene within 10 days. Ironvale would be formally notified. Rhea would be required to present. She spent the 4 days between filing and notification preparing. Not her argument. The argument was in the documents, in the ground markers, in 11 years of surveys she had conducted in good faith without knowing she was also quietly proving a land claim that should never have been erased. The argument was already built. She spent those 4 days preparing herself, which was a different kind of work. Venna helped her with that too. They sat together in the evenings, after Mira was in bed, and Venna told her the history she had not been told, the full story of Diva and the land and the succession and the 40 years since. She told it without sentimentality, and without score settling, told it the way a surveyor described ground. Here is what is there. Here is where the line actually runs. Here is what happens if you follow it. Rhea listened and said little, and felt the story settle into her body alongside everything else she had been carrying, not as a wound, but as information. Useful, precise, actionable. She thought about Theron every day. She would have been a liar to say otherwise. She thought about him in the early morning, when the bond pulled from the northeast, and she thought about him in the evenings, when Mira made a particular face. His jaw, his dark eyes set in her daughter's softer features, and she thought about him in the spaces between tasks when the work wasn't enough to fill the room. She thought about him, and she loved him, and she held those two things alongside the thing he had done, the way you held a piece of surveying equipment alongside a map that the equipment had shown you was wrong. The instrument was real, the reading was real. What you did with the reading was a choice. She was making hers. Notification arrived on the 18th. A registry courier, neutral, Interpack, no Ironvale insignia, delivered it to Venna's door. The registry court would convene on the 22nd. Rhea's presence was required. Ironvale's Alpha King had been notified and was required to attend in person or to send an authorized representative. She read the word representative and put the notice down on the table. She thought, he will send a scribe, he will make it a procedural matter. He will manage it the same way he manages everything, with competence and distance and the particular skill of a man who has learned to make the difficult things look simple by not looking at them too hard. She thought that, and then she put it away. She did not need him to attend in person. She did not need anything from Theron, except for the registry to do its work. The 22nd came with a sky that had gone the clear, colorless blue of deep winter, the kind that sat over the land like glass and made every edge sharp. Rhea dressed carefully, her surveyor's clothes, the professional kit she had brought in her pack, the worn leather jacket she had bought herself in her first year of independent commission and had kept through everything. She braided her hair. She checked on Mira, who was going to spend the day with Venna, and who handed Rhea a small stone she had found in the yard, smooth and gray, as a traveling gift. She closed her fist around the stone and walked to the registry hall. The hall was in the border settlement between Ironvale and the Eastern Pack territories, neutral ground by design. She arrived 20 minutes early and stood in the vestibule with the cold still coming off her jacket, and she organized her documents in the order she would present them, and she did not think about anything except the work. He was already there. She knew before she saw him, felt the bond activate with the proximity, a full-body recognition that was involuntary and immediate and as familiar as her own heartbeat. He was standing at the far end of the vestibule, with his back to her, looking out the narrow window at the winter fields, and he had not sent a scribe. He had come himself, which she had not allowed herself to anticipate. Rhea pressed her back against the wall for 3 full seconds, gathering herself. Then she walked to the registration table and signed in, and the registrar informed her that the session would begin in 15 minutes, and she found a seat along the wall and did not look at Theron. He looked at her. She felt it on the side of her face, that particular quality of attention she had spent 11 years learning the flavor of, the way his focus had gravity, the way it had always made her feel, involuntarily, that she was the most real thing in whatever room they shared. She stared at her documents. Rhea. His voice was quiet and low, and it arrived in her body before it arrived in her ears. She looked up. He was standing 4 feet from her. She had not heard him cross the room, or she had, and had refused to track it. He looked the way he always looked, dark-haired and careful, and he also looked wrong in a way she had no instrument for, some quality of wrongness that lived under the surface of his face, like a fracture in stone that only shows when you know where to look. She had spent 11 years learning exactly where to look. "The session begins in 14 minutes, she said. "I know." He did not move. "I didn't send a representative." "I can see that." "I needed to." He stopped. Theron did not stop, as a rule. He organized his thoughts before he opened his mouth, and he said things cleanly and completely, and he did not trail off mid-sentence. She had seen him do it, in 11 years, twice, once when his father died, and once when Mira was born, and he had looked at her in Rhea's arms, and had apparently run entirely out of the words he had prepared. "I need to tell you what I knew," he said, "before we go in there." "You knew enough," she said. She watched him register the precision of those words, watched him understand that she had already built the full picture, that she was not coming to this session to discover what he had done, but to correct it. She watched something move through his face that was not the managed competence she had seen at the assembly. It was rawer than that, and it made her chest ache with the dull ache of the bond, which did not have the decency to care about what he had done, which simply recognized him and pulled toward him with its unreasonable, constitutional warmth. "Rhea," his voice dropped. He was 4 feet from her, and she felt the distance between them as a physical quantity, a specific measurement she could have given in units, could have drawn on a map. "No," she said, not unkindly, not with heat. With the flat precision of a woman drawing a boundary line. "Not here, not before I do what I came to do. Whatever you need to say to me, you say it when this is finished." He looked at her for a long moment. His jaw was set. His hands, she noticed, were not entirely still. Then he nodded, a single, complete nod. "All right," he said, and stepped back. The registry session lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes. Rhea presented the documents. She presented the ground markers and the photographic surveys. She presented Gale's testimony and the original boundary notation from the sealed canister and the chain of surveys she had conducted over 12 years, each one contributing, point by point, to the same evidentiary conclusion. The severance of 40 years ago had been procedurally irregular, had been conducted without the required witness from the affected bloodline, and had served a specific and self-interested administrative purpose. It was not a legal severance, it was a suppression. The original registration stood. The registry judge, a woman named Sora, who had been reviewing interpack boundary claims for 30 years and who had the face of someone who had heard every possible argument and been moved by very few of them, listened to all of it without expression. She listened to Ironvale's representative argument, offered by a court scribe Theron had apparently also brought despite attending himself, which Rhea found both professionally thorough and personally revealing. She asked 12 precise questions. She reviewed the sealed canister document herself, holding it at an angle to the light the way someone with very old training does, someone who learned to read original notation in an era before photographic reproduction. After the first hour, she said to the room, "The exile decree issued by the Ironvale Alpha King against Rhea of the Eastern Settlements, bonded mate of the Alpha King, will be suspended pending this determination." After the second hour, she said, "The original registration stands. The severance is reversed. Mira, daughter of Rhea of the Eastern Settlements, holds matrilineal right of settlement in the Northeastern Territories as recorded in the pre-registry documentation, under interpack law." After 2 hours and 40 minutes, she closed the session and the room began to empty. Rhea sat for a moment with her hands in her lap and let the session settle into her body. She felt Gale's hand on her shoulder, briefly, and squeezed it. She watched people file out through the hall's double doors. She looked down at the smooth gray stone Mira had given her, which she had kept in her jacket pocket through the entire session, and she held it in her palm. Theron was the last person in the room apart from her. She heard him sit down in the chair beside her, not across the table, not at a professional distance, but beside her. The chair turned to face her, close enough that she could feel the warmth coming off him. She had always been acutely aware of his warmth. It was one of the first things she had noticed about him, standing at the drafting table 11 years ago, their forearms nearly touching, that he ran warm, that being close to him in winter felt like standing near a banked fire. She looked up. He was looking at her with the undefended quality she had only seen from him in private, never in public, never in the managed spaces where he was also the Alpha King. Just Theron. The one who had sat with her through 3 days of labor, when Mira didn't come easily, who had read to her from the cartography journals she kept by the bed because they were the only thing that distracted her, who had laughed at her jokes about the Vel River's spring shift for 11 years and never let the joke get old. "Tell me," she said. He told her. He said it clearly, without the managed competence, without organization. He said his father's archivist had brought him the irregularity report 8 months ago, and he had instructed the archivist to research it fully, believing it was a clerical error. He said that when the research came back, when he understood what the severance actually was, what Arkin had done, and what the reversal of that severance would mean for Mira's land claim, he had brought it to his court. He said the court's position had been unambiguous, that the land claim created a jurisdictional conflict with existing allocations, that the simplest resolution was to treat the original registration as continuing invalid, and that to do that legally required removing the claimant from the territory. He said the claimant was his wife. He said he had signed the decree. He did not say he had believed it was right. He said he had told himself it was manageable, that he would find another way to resolve the land claim once Rhea was out of the immediate jurisdictional reach of the Ironvale Registry, and he recognized, saying it now, that what he had told himself was exactly the kind of organized, competent lie a man tells when he knows what the right thing is and finds it inconvenient. He said, "I knew enough." The bond in her chest was very loud. She let it be loud. She looked at him beside her, this man who had known her better than anyone she had ever met, who had sat at a drafting table with her on the 4th morning of their acquaintance and corrected her river because it was wrong and it mattered that it was right, who had built a house with east-facing windows because she had mentioned once, in passing, that she liked morning light. She looked at him and she let herself want him, briefly and completely, and without pretending she didn't. the way the bond had been asking her to do for 22 days. Then she said, "I'm not coming back to Ironvale." She felt him absorb that. His hands were on his knees. He did not argue. "Mira has the land claim," she said. "I'll settle the northeastern territories. They're mine by her right. I'll build a registry office there. The pre-registry network has been working without formal representation for 40 years, and it needs one. I'll do that work. Mira will grow up on the land that was meant to be hers." He nodded slowly, a careful, complete nod. "You can see her," she said. I'm not using her against you. She loves you, and that matters more than what you did, and she deserves a father who shows up. But you will travel to us. You will travel to the northeastern reach, and you will sit at my table in the house I build, and you will see her there." She paused. "That is not a negotiation." "I know," he said. The afternoon light through the registry hall's narrow windows was long and low, lying across the floor in copper-colored oblongs. He reached out, then, and put his hand over hers, not gripping, not asking, just placing his hand over her hand on the table, the way you would steady a map you didn't want the wind to take. She felt his warmth move from his palm into the back of her hand. She looked at that, for a moment. His hand over hers, the bond singing between them, with its unconditional, stubborn warmth. She turned her hand over and held his. Not forgiveness. Not yet, and maybe not ever, and she had no intention of pretending otherwise. But acknowledgement. The same acknowledgement she gave to every landmark she noted on a survey. Here, this exists. This is part of the ground I am working. He was part of the ground she was working. "I'll come to the northeastern reach," he said, "as often as you'll let me." "Every season," she said. "For Mira." A pause, deliberate, measured. "We'll see about the rest." He looked at her, and she looked at him, and the bond between them was neither healed nor severed, but was simply present in the way that territory was present. Real, registered, occupying its actual extent. She had drawn the line where it actually ran, not where it had been recorded. That was the work. That had always been the work. She closed her hand around his once, firm and brief, the grip of someone acknowledging a landmark before moving on. Then she released it, gathered her documents, and stood. Outside, the winter sky had gone from colorless blue to the deep gold of late afternoon, and the cold was the clean kind, the kind that had no moisture in it, that simply made the edges of things precise and clear. She walked out into it and stood on the step and breathed, and she did not wait for him to follow her, and she did not look back, and her chest was full, of the bond, of the grief, of the stubborn particular satisfaction of a woman who had read the ground correctly and drawn the line where it actually was, and who was going, now, to build something on the right side of it. She had the documents. She had the ground markers. She had Venna's knowledge and Gail's witness and the stone in her pocket that her daughter had given her as a traveling gift. She had the northeastern reach and the house she would build and the registry office that had been waiting 40 years for someone to open it. She had herself, which was, she understood now, the thing she had always had, the instrument, the gift, the inheritance that no registry could erase and no decree could send into the Ironwood. She pressed her hand against the cold air and felt the bond hum at the back of it, pointing northeast, pointing home. She went home.